All right, good morning, everybody. So today we are going to be moving on to the second part of chapter 22, which focuses primarily on our two-party system. So we're going to be talking mainly about Democrats and Republicans, a little bit behind how those parties started in the first place. There's also going to be some ed puzzles that I will assign later this week that cover those topics as well. And these are your notes. I'll give you guys a copy as usual. And obviously, pay attention because it's an ed puzzle. So make sure you guys are keeping track of what's being said and make sure you're paying attention so you can answer the questions correctly. All right. So before we begin, the first question we have to ask ourselves is, and I'm sure a lot of you know the answer to this based on what we've talked about. Do you think that political parties were mentioned in the Constitution? And the answer is no, they were not. So political parties were never a thing when our founding fathers were constructing the Constitution. And as we already talked about, we talked about how George Washington himself warned against several things, but one of them being the formation of political parties in his famous farewell address that we covered a few weeks ago. But, against his wishes, early in our country's history, political parties had already started to form. And although we are very familiar with Democrats, Republicans, as we are today, you guys are all kind of familiar with the two groups that formed at the start of our nation's history. And those two groups, if you remember, are the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. However, their formal name was the Democratic Republicans. Okay, so I know we always referred to them as anti-feds and feds, but instead of anti-federalists, they were really also known as the Democratic Republicans. So don't get confused by that as we talk about this. Okay. So again, that little brief history. This is kind of a review because we already did this before. Federalists, all right, if they were part of the Federalist Party. So remember when the Constitution was being created, some founding fathers wanted one set of things and others wanted another set of things. So the ones that supported a strong federal government were Federalists. Okay, so they supported the Constitution as it was written initially. Okay, they wanted a strong federal government. The supporters of this party mainly were people who were merchants, bankers, and businessmen, and they all have something in common, and they generally deal with large sums of money. And for a while, the Federalists, existed as the Federalists, and as these parties have tended to do over time, they sort of change, okay, and they may not change in terms of, what they believe in, but sometimes they change in terms of the name that they go by. So the Feds shifted to a name, the Whig Party, sort of, okay, so they weren't exactly like the Federalists, but they were very, very similar. And eventually that party formed into what we know today as the Republican Party, which started in 1854. The other party, the Democratic Republicans, or as we know them as the Anti-Federalists or Anti-Feds, they were quite the opposite of the Federalists. If you remember, they opposed a strong federal government. They were against that. Okay, so Thomas Jefferson, he was really the leader of the Anti-Federalists. Again, the same person who played a very big role in pretty much writing the Constitution as a whole. So he led this group, and him and his party were supported by farmers, by frontier settlers, by manual laborers. Again, people that if we categorized them by today's standards, we would call them blue collar workers. So we'll get into white collar, blue collar later on. And they officially became the Democratic Party in 1834. Okay, so they started out as just the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, but eventually they morphed into the names that we're more familiar with today as the Republicans and the Democrats. So when we talk about this, what I mean by two-party system, if you guys remember, we were talking about different political party systems that exist in our world, and a two-party system is very rare. There's not many nations that have a two-party system. Most have either a one-party system or they have a multi-party system. Okay, so the Republican and Democratic parties make up the United States, our country's two-party system. And that two-party system officially began in 1854. So in 1854, that's when the Republican Party was formed, okay, which is mainly like a northern party. And the Democratic Party, which was formed in the 1830s, was mainly a southern party. So again, we talk about George Washington's farewell address. He didn't want political parties because he was afraid that people would support, regions would form and they would support the party and not the right people. But again, we didn't really do a good job of listening to him. So a little more background on these two parties. So when this two-party system formed, for the majority of the, beginning and, the vast majority of the two-party system early on, the Republican Party dominated the presidency and Congress for quite some time, about 70 years, from 1860, which is right before the Civil War began, and 1930, okay, which is right around the time of the Great Depression, which we will get into later on a little bit, and with that puzzles too. Our buddy Abraham Lincoln was actually the first Republican president elected into office. And his election into office is actually really what was like the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of the Civil War starting. So as Abraham Lincoln was elected as president, the South seceded from the Union, and that's really what began the Civil War. The Democratic Party, however, after years and years of really not having much of a hold on the power in our government, eventually started to take control. And it started with a man by the name of, as some of you may know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, also known as FDR. He was elected in 1932, right smack dab in the middle of the Great Depression. Okay, so he instituted a lot of policies that were helping the common folk, which things like called like the first and second New Deals. You guys will learn about that later on. You should have learned about it in sixth grade, and you'll learn about it again when you guys get to high school. But pretty much they were plans to help the nation get out of the Great Depression. And that is really when the Democratic Party began to gain a foothold in our government. Okay. And from that point on, both parties have traded power frequently since then. So I know I spent a lot of time talking about the two main parties of our system, but believe it or not, there are other parties that exist. So having a two-party system does not necessarily mean there are only two parties. Okay. So for almost all of American history, presidential elections have been dominated by Republicans and Democrats, as we know. But third parties do arise from time to time during these elections. Third parties usually are formed to support a cause or a main idea, and they can also be formed to support a particular candidate, a candidate that does not, that does not define themselves as either Republican or Democrat. All right. So if we take a look at some of these pictures up in the top right-hand corner, these are the more popular third parties that the United States has had. You have a party like the Libertarian Party, which is pretty much a party that, recognizes, the idea that the government should not really be involved in our lives at all. Okay, so that's like, again, supporting an idea. The Green Party, kind of, based on the name, based on the look of the symbol, the Green Party has a big role when it comes to supporting, a green environment, a clean environment, the decrease of using up all of our natural resources, alternative sources of energy, things like that. A lot of these you haven't heard of, and you probably never will hear of in current events. But There's a reason for that, because third parties tend to face problems when it comes to elections. As you might imagine, if you live in a nation that has two main parties, it's really hard for a third party to gain traction, to gain a foothold. Most states favor the two-party system within the states. Now, there are some states that do have like third parties that stick their head out every now and then, and because they favor a two-party system, sometimes there's not enough room for a third party. Okay, so they lack popularity, they lack funding. These things are very important in order for parties to gain power, to gain notoriety. And if they don't have popularity or funding, it can be really tough to gain the attention of the public. And a lot of citizens tend to, I know it just kind of went away, but citizens tend to see like voting for a third party as like a wasted vote, because your vote's not going to go anywhere. And in most cases, that's true. There have been times when third parties have gained some traction in our government, but for the most part, they've been kind of irrelevant in some ways. Okay, so there are a few ways that third parties have influenced our government. I'm going to let you guys read those, and you'll answer some questions on that right now. All right, so again, when we're talking about the Democrats and the Republicans, okay, so some of you may have heard like the terms left or right, okay? What that means is this is going to be something we do later on. But when you kind of want to think of our government as like a line, okay? I wouldn't say our government, but like our political affiliations is like a big line, kind of like the line that you see right over here, okay? So if you are on the left side of that line, you are Democrat, okay? You tend to be more liberal. You tend to be, similar to the anti-feds. You feel that the government should not be as heavily involved. Sorry, let me rephrase that. If you are on the left, you tend to think that the government should be more involved in your lives. If the further you go right, you tend to be, again, if someone says you're more right, it means you're more conservative, more Republican, meaning that you don't feel that the government should have as much of a foothold in your life. Okay, so these are some of the more basic philosophies of the Democrats and Republicans. So I'm going to let you guys take a look at that right now. All right, so although both parties are, as you read, are very different from each other, they do share some important similarities. So in terms of differences, again, they're platforms and planks. Okay, so like for example, Republicans tend to support lesser, less restrictions on guns, whereas Democrats tend to support more restrictions on guns. They have different views when it comes to education. They have different views when it comes to abortion. They have different views when it comes to the environment. Okay, so those are all types of platforms. Okay, and they have their own take on these platforms. They tend to attract different supporters. Again, there's a group of people that wants the government involved in their lives, and there are people that do not really want the government involved. And depending on how you feel about that, you're going to vote one way or the other. Okay. And they also have very different historical traditions. They do have many similarities, though, because in the end, each party wants to attract a diverse group of voters. Okay, so both rich and poor, white collar, blue collar jobs. Again, white collar, think doctors, lawyers, okay, pharmacists, people like that. Blue collar, you tend to think of people that work with their hands more, work longer hours, more manual physical labor. People who live in rural environments, in the woods, away from everybody. People who live in urban environments like cities, okay? And also, they're also very similar in the way they're organized. Local, state, and national level of organization for both parties is very similar, okay? So what I mean by that is this. So party organization for both parties is very similar. So in the end, Democrats and Republicans, or the Democratic and Republican parties, are set up in similar ways at the local and state and national levels, okay? The organizations at these levels work independently, meaning that they don't all turn to one single person, and that person then decides what they all do. They all work independently. So the federal government, state government, and the local governments, when it pertains to political parties, they operate on their own. They make their own decisions. Now, the decisions they make usually are based off of the philosophy of each party, but in the end, it's their own decisions that they're making. Individual members at the local level are most important part of any party. When you think about it, people like us are really the foundation of these parties because we are the support for these parties at the national level. So it starts in the local, works their way up to state, and then eventually to the national or federal level. It starts with us, though. So we are the foundation. And when you look at kind of like this pyramid here, kind of like the food chart, I think grains and wheat and carbs and stuff like that are at the bottom. That makes up the most of that, of our food pyramid. We make up the most of our pyramid of government levels, okay, if you will. Vocab term, each community is divided into precincts, all right, or voting districts. Precincts, it's a way to break up states in order to make it easier to organize or to, organize votes and things of that nature. When elections roll around, when primaries roll around, they're generally made up of around fewer than 1,000 voters that vote at the same polling place. Okay, so for example, depending on where you guys live, you have to go to a certain place to vote. So you're all in a precinct. Okay, so that is where that's the precinct you're a part of. It means that you go to a certain place in order to vote. Parties at the local level elect people to city and county committees. Okay, so city council, town council, things like that. Each party is also organized at the state level. Okay, so much like the national conventions that we've talked about before, each state holds its own convention as well, where party leaders write platforms, nominate potential candidates, and raise money. Again, the party tends to pick the candidates, but we do play some small role in trying to get certain people to run for certain political positions and political office positions. But in the end, it's the parties that choose those positions. Once every 4 years, each party holds a national convention. So we're kind of working our way up the pyramid right now. And delegates for each party write party platforms and nominate candidates for president and vice president. Okay, so it literally works itself in, starting with local level, state level, national or federal level. And that's how it goes up. All right. When it comes to supporting a party, I mean, you guys are at an age where, politics may not be that important to you. I know some of you are really into it. Some of you aren't. But at some point, you guys are going to be able to vote. And that means eventually you're going to want to support one side or the other. Or maybe you won't support any side. We'll get to that in a minute. As a U.S. citizen, you are free to support any party you want. There's no laws or rules that require you support any party. You even have the right to not vote, although some people would argue that it's silly not to vote. But in the end, it's your, it's your right to choose whether to vote and support a party or not vote at all and not support anyone. Your views on major political issues tend to influence which party you support. So the views of family, friends, and coworkers, they can play a big role in your own political views. Okay, so like your family may be a heavily Democratic family or a heavily Republican family in terms of the way they view their political topics and views. And that can have a major influence on what you decide to look at or what you decide to value down the road. We have 2 slides left. So historically, political parties have maintained their strength through a combination of 3 different elements. Okay, one of these elements, the first one, is a vocab term, and that is patronage. So how does patronage come into play? So patronage is a system in which party leaders perform favors for loyal supporters of the party. So if you support someone, if you support a party, they're going to help you out. That gives you incentive to continue to support them, and then maybe you can gain more supporters for them if they treat you right. So for example, presidents always do this. They appoint loyal members to cabinet positions. Okay, Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of War, things like that. All right, so If you are supportive of a particular presidential candidate in this case, and you put all of your support behind that one person and they end up winning, you can benefit from that in the end. Okay. Parties do get involved. The second element is that parties get involved in the campaigns. Back in the day, they used to get a lot more involved and they would really take the lead on a lot of these campaigns that candidates would go through. However, candidates tend to do that on their own now, and the party will back them. The party will support them, but the candidates tend to, these days they raise their own money, they do their own traveling, they handle their own expenses, and schedule their own events and rallies and whatnot. So parties used to play a bigger role in that. Nowadays, they don't play as big a role in that. The candidates themselves take care of that. Okay. And the last major element we're going to discuss is voter loyalty. Okay. And this is something that hurts parties. It can help a party, but it can also hurt a party. Present day, it's also been that way for, as long as this country has been around and as long as we've had political parties. So today, roughly 40 to 45% of citizens vote on what we call a straight ticket, which is a ballot cast. So when you guys go to vote, you're going to get into a polling place. You're going to be surrounded by dividers so nobody can, spy on you and see what you're doing for votes. And you're going to see a list of names in front of you. Okay. Now, there are lots of people that vote on a straight ticket, which means that it's a ballot cast for all candidates of one party. So some people will literally go in there and they'll go, okay, I'm Republican. I'm going to vote for every Republican candidate, regardless of what they support, regardless of any plans they have to improve our town, to improve our state, to improve our nation. I'm just going to vote for them because they're Republican. Believe it or not, people do this a lot. That's really an old school way of voting. Nowadays, voters tend to base their decisions on the appeal of a particular candidate or on an issue rather than party loyalty. So party loyalty is something that still happens, but it's a little antiquated. It's a little old-fashioned. Okay, so like my grandparents, for example, they were very strict with like one party, and it didn't matter to them who was running, what they said. They're going to vote for the party. People don't really do that as much. People still do it, but not nearly as much as before. Many people now do what they call a split ticket, which means it's the practice of voting for candidates of more than one party on the same ballot. So you may cast a vote for a Republican for, presidency, but then you might cast your vote for a Democratic senator or a Democratic governor, okay, or a Democratic congressman or woman, all right? So people tend to be more diverse with what they vote for. They're not voting just for the party, they're voting for the people. And I think that's, again, what George Washington wanted us to do. He wanted us to not just support a party, but to support the best person to lead our nation, to lead our, towns, cities, states, whatnot. Okay. Sometimes voters tend to choose for many different reasons. A lot of it, like I said, family history. Sometimes like families have always been Republican voters or always been Democratic voters, and they'll just vote for that group no matter what. Sometimes it's a regional thing. Like I said, these days, okay, I know Republican Party used to dominate the North and the Democrats dominate the South. It's kind of flipped now. It's flipped in the last 50, 60 years. Now, if you're in the North, you tend to be very pro-Democrat. If you're in the South, you tend to be very pro-Republican. So sometimes where you grow up has a lot to do with that. These days, okay, your generation, my generation, tend to be what we call independent voters, which are people who do not vote for a particular party. They vote for who they feel is the best candidate, okay? And to tell you the truth, that is the largest number of young voters these days. They are independent voters. They don't support the party. They don't just, vote on a straight ticket. It's a split ticket, and they tend to be independent. So when you go to a polling place, you can mark yourself as an independent voter. You don't have to pick a party. You can just say, I'm independent, and we'll see what happens when the voting starts. Okay? All right, so that's it for today. As far as notes, keep these handy. We'll be using these another time, and hope you guys have a great day. If you guys have any questions, comments, concerns, you guys know where to find me, and talk to you guys soon. Have a good day.